So it's my great pleasure to have really these great experts today with me, Dr. Amy Bonomi and Dr. Nelia Viveros. They will talk about unconscious bias. Dr. Amy Bonomi is a professor of human development and the director of the Women's Leadership Institute at Michigan State University. Dr. Bonomi co-edited the award-winning book, Women Leading Change Academia, Breaking the Glass Ceiling, Cliff and Slipper. She, by the way, published this together with a colleague here at the University of Colorado. And this book is also endorsed by the American Psychological Association and convenes the perspectives of 23 diverse female leaders on issues of leadership and the challenges of confronting structural racism, bias, and discrimination. Dr. Bonomi is a regular contributor on equity and social justice issues in the Huffington Post and The Conversation. Then a second speaker, Dr. Nelia Viveros. She's the interim vice chancellor for diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Colorado. She also holds a faculty appointment in the School of Education and Human Development. And Dr. Viveros' focus in higher education has been on managing large-scale change efforts and mitigating conflict and trauma in the workspace, especially within the context of higher education and with the lens of social justice and equity. And in 2020, she was awarded the University Thomas Jefferson Award for her achievement in advancing the cause of civic responsibility and for her commitment to the welfare and rights of the individual. So I'm really excited to have both here. And I have seen both are working on a second book, is that true? And they also just published an editorial on unconscious bias in the setting of virtual meetings. And so I'm very excited, looking forward to the talk. And at the end, I have some panelists with me who will join the discussion. I have Dr. Clavijo, Dr. Vogeli, and Dr. Brainerd. And so I'm very excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Amy, did you want me to advance the slide?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Eckel. Appreciate being here, and thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to be working with you. We've got an interactive presentation today. So I think, as we all know, 6 or 7 months ago, most of us thrust into a virtual environment in many of our professional spaces, although many I know are going to still to medical centers to interface with patients and other healthcare providers. Today, we're going to talk specifically about defining and exploring unconscious bias and microaggressions within those virtual spaces with a specific focus on academic medicine, and Dr. Viveros will cover more specifically those academic medicine angles as we get further into the presentation. So we'll start first with talking about unconscious bias and microaggressions generally, and then move more specifically into what this looks like in virtual settings. The next slide, please. So we talk about unconscious bias or implicit bias. My guess is that most on today's call have had some exposure to these concepts of unconscious bias and implicit bias. The definition is really attitudes towards people or associated stereotypes with people or groups of people without our conscious knowledge. There's some debate in the literature, of course, to what extent bias is largely unconscious or conscious. In some cases, we do have some conscious knowledge that we carry certain biases with us. But for a large bit, we're talking about unconscious bias. It's that which lies below the surface, related to things such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and age is the 6th critical category. What these unconscious biases do is they tend to serve to include and exclude at these social identity points. We'll talk about how this looks both in virtual and non-virtual settings. Next slide, please. When we talk about unconscious bias, we also talk about the concept of thinking under the influence. So to reassure everyone on today's call, we all carry unconscious bias. So there's sometimes we have the question of, great, I have bias, how do I get rid of it? Or I want to rid myself and not have any more bias. The reality is none of us were able to completely eradicate or eliminate bias from our perspective, because we operate under mental constructs that cultivate through our interactions with social structures across our lifespan, beginning at birth. So in that early childhood period, birth to age 5, and our family of origin or other important caregivers in that early period really shape our perceptions. When we look at those social identity points related to gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, etc. Peers become an incredibly important influence, of course, in middle school and high school, and in fact, replacing the influence of our family of origin and other adult caregivers in that middle and high school period in shaping our perceptions of gender, race, sexual orientation. Schools, religious institutions, healthcare all shape perceptions of how we perceive gender. Pop culture is another venue, and then Google search engines. We'll engage you in a couple of interactive exercises involving Google search engines to show the extent in which our unconscious biases are shaped by what pops up in search engines when we search for common terms. Next slide, please. So I'm a professor of human development. I'm not a historian. I do like history. This next slide that I'm showing comes from my grandmother's freshman composition book in the late 1920s. She attended St. Augustine High School in Chicago. On the left-hand side of the page, you see at the time they were studying trademarks. And for those in the United States, you probably recognize familiar car names such as Buick and Ford. The smaller logo at the bottom, Del Monte, a lot of fruits and vegetables. And then you likely also notice the Aunt Jemima pancake flour mix. Aunt Jemima pancake flour mix, I'm gonna call your attention to this specifically, was a problematic representation of Black slave archetype, basically an exploited African-American women, first introduced in the late 1800s and became very popular in the mid 1915 or so. And it became one of the most popular pancake mixes. It was discontinued in June of 2020 following the murder of George Floyd because of the problematic representation of, again, the archetypal slave representation. But just to show the extent to which freshmen in high school were being shaped by these various trademarks. On the right-hand side of the page, she's drawn a picture of William Shakespeare. As I look through the composition notebook, all of the writers that they were studying at the time, not surprisingly, were white men. What does that basically tell us is that they were being taught to delegitimize writers of color, women writers, et cetera. So just kind of say these all shaped our perceptions of gender, race, ethnicity. Next slide, please, Alia. So we have 2 interactive exercises. It would take us about 3 minutes to go through. So if you would be willing to engage us in popping some comments in the chat box, and I'll ask Dr. Viveros to monitor the chat because I can't see it right now. When we say the term university president, what comes to mind? If you could just throw in the chat, what comes to mind when we say the term university president?
Boss, white privileged male, sets the rules, white male, fundraising, intelligent, male, right? White male, voted in, old, maybe, bald with glasses, white male with nice car and a prime parking spot, male industry, head.
Right, so before you go to the next slide, Dr. Rivera, so I'm glad thank you for engaging us in that exercise. So certainly when we have these perceptions, we're talking about unconscious bias here, you talked about male, so you talked about gender, you talked about age, so tended to be older, you talked about race, tended to be white, certainly more predominant things that are coming through in the chat. You also talked about elements of privilege, such as the parking spot, such as being voted in, et cetera. So before we go to the next slide, Dr. Rivera, I'd like to ask all of you, if you have your laptop or pad open, if you could open a Google browser or Yahoo browser and type in university president and do an image search. And if you'd be willing to throw in the chat box what you see when you do the image search for university president. Anything coming in the chat? Anything coming up as you're searching for university president?
Nothing yet.
Okay.
Mostly old white guys, yeah, mostly old white guys. It's coming from Allison. Mine is coming with a lot of diversity, all male. Yep, but scroll down and it gets different, right?
All right, so next slide, please, Dr. Viveros. So often what we see in these Google browsers are kind of the effect that Google does have some bias that kind of built in that shapes our own unconscious biases. When I typed in university president into my Google browser, this is what showed up on my first page. So generally speaking, consistent with what you said when we said, what do you think of when you think of university president? We see white, male, privileged settings at boardrooms, libraries, et cetera. We say one representation of an African-American president for Howard University, which is traditional HBCU. And he's mentioned twice here on this page. Next slide, please, Dr. Viveros.
So we're going to follow the same exercise. And just if you can throw in the chat, when we use the term a disabled person, what comes to mind? And I'll monitor the chat. So again, we're looking for your wheelchair. Right. The most interesting college presidents arranged alphabetically. We've got another wheelchair. Right. So we're going to get you to do the same. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to do the same search, if you would, using your browser. And just let me know what's coming up for your images as well. Similar to what we just did. So you're looking up disabled person or a disabled person. Give you a minute or so to do that, a few seconds. Yeah, indeed, wheelchair. So some confirmation, mostly in a wheelchair. Old guy in wheelchair. My Google search is worse than me. Yeah, so interesting representations. Anything about race? I know the wheelchair was confirmed. What about race or gender? And somebody's brought up all photos, 95% wheelchair, 2 individuals with Down syndrome, wheelchair, mostly white males, all white. Right, so here's what I found when we did, well, Amy and I found when we did the search, right? A lot of white, obviously, so race was an interesting depiction here. Lots of wheelchairs, right? The images, if you will, right, are sort of the stereotypical sort of unconscious bias that we carry about sort of what disability means, right? The obvious manifestation being in a wheelchair, the idea that sort of it's a passive picture, as opposed to somebody mentioned, you 2 individuals with Down syndrome, all of the spectrum of disabilities that exist, right? The stereotype here, right, is one, the portrayal is a kind of a common classic media one of people being dependent. There's not a lot of activity per se. You don't often see a lot of smiling. In fact, you see the words tied things you should never say to a disabled person or desperate disabled people online. Some stuff about awareness or caring, a lot of stuff about this sort of passive dependent archetype that we see portrayed in the media. Thank you for engaging with that. We wanted to use these examples as just to sort of start a discussion about how we should carry. And again, all of you, and I do this too, we all went to this idea of wheelchair as our most obvious manifestation when disability can mean a lot of things. Dr. Bonomi, I think this is yours.
Yep, so unconscious bias, how does it manifest? We'll talk about language, symbolism, and visual cues, and then actions of commission and omission. First, we'll talk generally and then move into that virtual environment. Next slide, please. So we talk about unconscious bias language. Common example that we use in this equity work is asking a person of color why they speak English so well. When we talk about visual and symbolism cues, when you buy a picture frame, for example, or a new washer and dryer or similar items, they typically market to white consumers. So on the right-hand side of the page here, we have an image of a photo frame insert that I pulled from one of my photo frames at home. And you can see picture of white woman and child. Again, nothing to take away from the beautiful representation here, but pretty common. I was at a home improvement store here in the Denver area over this past week. Walked up the photo aisle, literally every single photo frame that was being marketed had images of white individuals intended to be in kind of the 25 to 35-year-old age range, able-bodied, representations and heterosexual as well. In terms of actions, we know from the literature studies that resumes, for example, with white sounding names versus Black and Latinx sounding names or looking names tend to be evaluated differently. With those resumes with white names tend to be evaluated more favorably upon sort of initial evaluation for qualifications for an interview, and then during the interview themselves, and then whether they made job offers. Next slide, please. This is probably my favorite slide in the presentation. So this is another example how unconscious bias manifests. This was a study done of more than 81,000 performance evaluations of male versus female leaders. And I'd like if you could just throw into the chat, what do you see around the words used to describe men in their annual evaluations versus the words used to describe women in their annual evaluations? And again, these are male and female leaders. What do you see in terms of differences? Words used to describe men, words used to describe women. Maternal words used for the women leaders. Yep. Others, I know it's fairly early in the morning.
Positive, negative in men, many more negative words for women. I see more negative words with women, more negative for women, caring, more negative comments for women.
Yeah, exactly. There's a couple things that we'd point out on this slide. So when we look at the words used to describe men, most of the words are positive and most of the words are associated with the position at hand. So for example, analytical, competent, articulate, level-headed. There's a couple of negative words, arrogant and irresponsible. Arrogant in some disciplines could be perceived as a positive trait in some, for example, CEOs or maybe surgeon. Arrogance is a kind of representation of confidence in some ways. When we look at the words used to describe women, fewer positive words, and most of the words used to describe them when we're talking about the negative words are related to emotionality, not related to the position of hand. So inept, selfish, scattered, opportunistic, excitable. We know from consistently study after study, whether it's graduate students, whether it's medical students, whether it's residents, whether it's female male leaders, all of these things shape who gets promoted, who gets considered for higher level positions. So these words do matter. Next slide, please, Dr. Viveros. I also like this slide. So these are ratings. I'd ask for a show of hands if we were in a room together saying how many of you ever evaluated a professor that you had and had the opportunity to provide that anonymous feedback at the end of the semester, or maybe you've been evaluated as a professor. So on the left-hand side of the page here, we have ratemyprofessor.com, which is, is a public kind of venue where students can provide feedback on professors that they've had. On the right-hand side are university course evaluations. I'm showing this example for a male-female comparison. Again, what we see in both representations, both left and right-hand side of the page, is that Professor Mitchell, in this case is a woman, tends to be much more likely to be evaluated than based on her personality, whether she's entertaining in the classroom, her personality and her appearance, compared to Professor Martin, who's a man. She's also more likely to be referred to as a teacher rather than a professor. So those of you in the classroom or maybe supervising residents or others, maybe you're as a female, you even like to be called Miss or Mrs. Versus Doctor versus Professor, a pretty common thing that we see on that gender binary in ratings in academia. Next slide, please. Related definition that we want to cover is something called microaggressions. It's a term that was first introduced in the 1970s at Harvard University. It's been since adapted and really developed by Dr. Sui at Columbia University. Microaggressions are really these brief everyday exchanges that send negative messages to individuals and groups of individuals based on group membership. So it's related to unconscious bias because sometimes we're engaged in microaggressions or perpetrating a microaggression without knowing that we're doing it. So it's not to excuse the behavior, but just to say, just in the same way that our unconscious bias lies well beneath the surface, sometimes our microaggressions will be operating from that unconscious space as well. Dr. Sui breaks it in microaggressions into three different forms. Micro validations would be things like I don't see color. Micro assaults would be the use of racial epithets, such using the term colored people. And micro insults such as women are the weaker sex. There's some debate in the literature about whether there's differences. There's in fact differences between these three categories because they seem very similar, but Dr. Viveros will take us through a few examples to show there's the subtle nuances between a micro-invalidation, a micro-assault, and a micro-insult. Next slide, please.
So we pulled these tweets from the public domain, and they're, again, as Dr. Bonomi mentioned, we're going to use this as an example to show how this sort of plays out in the public space. These represent professors who are talking about student course evaluations they've received, many of which are easily classified, right, under these microaggressions rubric. So let's take a look at the tweets and how they reproduce stereotypes. So the first one, right, his physical handicap makes him bitter. This first one is about disability and how it makes someone a bitter and a bad person. And we use that example, right, of the sort of classic media portrayal of disability or Google search image as sort of in a wheelchair. This type of stereotyping goes back a long time. For example, in Victorian England, while Victorians didn't use the term disability, they would use terms now considered offensive like handicapped or crippled. They applied this sort of marginalizing other status to people with a wide variety of conditions, including dwarfism, blindness, deafness, paraplegia. So while in Victorian England, right, if a person didn't possess a physical or mental ability to be a productive worker, they were seen as defective and sort of othered in society, if you will. And that defectiveness was also thought to affect their moral character. The second tweet we see really ties to this archetype of angry Black woman. This is from Lorian Bowles. It says that she's also way too liberal in her teaching evaluations. So this is an American stereotype that goes far back in time. It portrays Black women as sassy, ill-mannered, and ill-tempered by nature. It's based on this racist ideology and meant to be used as a social control mechanism to punish Black women who violate societal norms, right, that encourage them to be passive, servile, and non-threatening and unseen. This is a form of the double bind for women, right? I'm both Black and a woman. And sort of the stereotype also has parables in this sort of strong Black women and strong independent paradigm that we see a lot in the literature, which kind of limits the ability of women to emote and sort of tries to pin them into this box. The third tweet asks for more stories of great isms that we all see in these student evaluations. And in the fourth one, we're told by Katie, I was told I graded too hard because I was on my period. So, right, this is an obviously gendered comment, sexist, and feeds into this trope of women being hysterical. There are many places in Nepal today, for example, that still banish women who are menstruating to their own secluded huts. In India today, for example, red symbolizes purity, and sin is also used to mark auspicious occasions. So what we see is women who are menstruating are viewed as unclean in some societies, untouchable, and having the power to bestow calamity upon people, the livestock, and the land when they're bleeding. So as a result, they get banished from their homes. Some stay in nearby sheds, while others must travel 10, 15 minutes away from home on foot through thick forest to these secluded places. Talk a little bit about unconscious bias in healthcare. I told Dr. Eckel last night, actually, I did a really quick search. There's scores of research in this area. I did a really quick search in Google Scholar, and just the word unconscious bias in health plus healthcare revealed about 600,000 hits. So it just goes to show you how this area has been exploding. We now see many states that are requiring training as mandatory for certain licensed professionals, and diversity and justice, right? We know that it's becoming the fabric of many, many places in higher ed, including, for example, the medicine department at Anschutz, right? You've got a diversity statement right in your mission. And cultural competency, right, is another piece that we're going to talk a little bit about because that's becoming quite a big discussion in this space. So we put up a few examples here of how bias is playing out particular to the healthcare context, and we're going to have a few more of these slides. Research is showing us that about 90% of the issues that differentially impact people are not caused by people wanting to get at someone, but rather that all of us sort of have these blind spots, right? So it goes back to this conscious versus unconscious that sort of stymie us in the space. Some DI programs, and this is something that we teach a lot here, continue to use a sort of good, bad person lens when we teach about this. We're really focused on looking at this from this unconscious lens, right? How we're, again, back to what Dr. Bonomi talked about earlier, the idea that this is reinforced by the institutions, how this is taught. It's normal through looking at through the lens of socialization. There's lots of research, for example, that shows that overweight people get treated differently by doctors. Cardiologists have been shown to send patients to thrombolytic therapy at different rates when they have different experiences with patient racial identities. And you can see some more examples here. There's a recent Canadian study that showed medical students actually who were interviewed on a rainy day were rated an equivalent 10% lower on their MCATs. Our natural tendency, right, in medicine is the golden rule to treat others as we would want to be treated, but to really treat a patient, which goes back to some of the work of Howard Ross in this area, is that we need to develop a better theory of mind and put ourselves in the patient's head. And we need to understand, right, going back to this conscious versus unconscious debate, is that we're seeing the world the way we want to see it, not the way necessarily that it is. So here, we have a little bit more of an example of unconscious bias playing out in the workforce with the gender lens. And Dr. Bonomi talked a little bit about this earlier. What we're seeing here in this space, particularly during the pandemic, actually, is that the gender gap is widening, right, pretty much everywhere. The enrollment of women in medical school has been nearly equivalent to that of men in the United States since 1999, but has recently surpassed that of men for the first time, actually, in a while. But despite this apparent equality, right, even back to 2017, only 41% of faculty and approximately 24% of full professors were women, right, tenure. These gaps are getting even larger, as you mentioned, but when you're looking, particularly when you look at things like department chairs or section chiefs or section heads, right, we're generally only about 14% are women. Many factors are likely contributing to this lack of equal representation. In medical careers beyond medical school, unconscious bias obviously is clearly one of the ones that we're advancing as one of the factors. And as we saw again in the non-medical examples, that the impact on gender, right, is the same in this work, whether you're understanding it in an academic medical context or not. And studies, right, consistently show, back to the Google Scholars results that I was finding, that bias is definitely where women are being differentially treated, along with all those critical other social identity points. And as the research shows here, they're not invited to speak as equally as men are at grand rounds, or less likely to be considered for academic leadership roles, for example. And sort of this positive tone that Dr. Bonomi was talking about, just even the way we evaluate in this space. Talk a little bit here, there's a case study, and this goes further into a little bit about gender, but also a lot about cultural competency, which I talked about. So the example here really deals with Vietnamese women who are delivering babies in a hospital. This is work carried out about 15 years ago that found Vietnamese mothers were more dehydrated when they were ready to give birth than other groups. They found, in fact, they're looking for patterns. It's like, why was this? And this was in a Midwest hospital. Why was this the case? What they found actually was this was a generalized pattern that wasn't just specific to the Midwest hospital. The reason was totally cultural, right? Vietnamese culture is based on this idea of hot and cold, this sort of yin and yang theory, that in traditional practice, labor and delivery in the Vietnamese culture is a cold time. So they don't drink cold drinks or have cold food. But of course, what happens in the American healthcare system, right, is that the nurse brings them ice chips and ice water to their bedside. They're not drinking it, which affects their health. It delays lactation. It means potentially longer hospital stay, which has financial implications. And you sort of question how many other examples like this are there in the system. In many cultures, blood and the state of pregnancy, for example, are often conceived as a state of hotness, and conversely, the postpartum period is conceived as a cold and vulnerable state. So hot foods in certain cultures are therefore encouraged to restore harmony and balance, while cold foods are to be avoided. How do we systemize these things, right, is kind of the question of the work we do here. We need to look first at the nature of the culture and healthcare education. We got a field of study that requires people, right, your field of study, to develop this sort of relatively high degree of competence, right? You need to work with seriously ill patients. You have no time to doubt yourself. There's almost like a trained arrogance in the field. It's understandable then when you add this academic side to the debate. So we're taught from the neck up, as they say, right, in academic medicine. How much information you have is really the currency and demonstrates your worth in this field. And admitting you don't know something, right, that we have these unconscious bias, sometimes is anathema to us. So the essence to take away here is that in many cultural views, beliefs and practices surrounding birth are very different from the biomedical view that we're taught and all that knowledge that we're taught in this space. And these cultural differences could contribute to misunderstandings between physicians and patients and could affect the quality and efficacy of the healthcare we provide. So the conclusions to draw from this case study, right, is that a sensitive and open approach to the patient's belief system, back to this issue of unconscious bias and cultural competency, sort of almost requires us to have this open and frank communication, is necessary to ensure effective prenatal and postnatal treatment for any group, but particularly for this group, right? Bias played a large impediment in this role here of treating Vietnamese women. I'm going to talk a little bit about unconscious bias in virtual settings, and I think I pass this back to Dr. Bonomi at this point. I do.
All right, so thank you. So let's talk now about how virtual environments, what's unique about virtual environments. We were talking specifically about unconscious bias and microaggressions in these settings. So when we think about virtual environments, whether they be Zoom, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, et cetera, even some email, right? Particularly when we're in Zoom settings, there's an intense concentration on multiple people. So we think about face-to-face settings, walking into a meeting room, walking into an operating room, for example. You typically have some knowledge and awareness of others in the room, both in terms of body language, facial expressions, et cetera. In these virtual settings, we're often sitting in front of the computer, right, with multiple faces on the screen, which can require a different kind of concentration than in face-to-face settings. We're also exposed to and conveying many different diverse environments. So for example, for those who have more of an office-based job who are on Zoom calls for, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Throughout the day, we might have known something about the personal lives of our colleagues, for example, whether they're married, whether they have children, whether they live in a house or an apartment. But for the first time in these virtual environments, we're exposed to these personal aspects in ways that we hadn't been before in the face-to-face settings. We also ourselves are conveying different diverse environments. So today, for example, both Dr. Viveros and I have chose a virtual background. I actually here upstairs in the loft, so sort of obscuring, right, the traditional environment that I'm in. We're missing important social cues. So which of the 5 senses do we tend to be missing on Zoom or WebEx, if you would throw that into the chat? So we've got 5 human senses. What are we typically missing in Zoom and WebEx and Microsoft Teams?
Smell, body language, smell, question mark, touch.
Yep, smell, touch, and taste. So assuming we have visual capacity, assuming that we have auditory capacity, those are typically the 2 senses that are activated in a Zoom or a WebEx or a Microsoft Teams environment. The smell, the taste, and the touch are missing in these settings. Well, why would taste matter, right? So why would we necessarily be in a face-to-face environment thinking about taste or thinking about smell? We think about maybe the ritual that we might have with a colleague of having a coffee or a tea in the morning, or having a weekly lunch with colleagues. All of those unconscious things that surround us that are sources of comfort usually are missing. The touch, when we go into a meeting room or maybe we're in the operating room, et cetera, the simple handing a tool off to somebody else, shaking a hand is missing in these virtual environments. And then finally, the equity space is different. So not everybody can display their visual, for example. So I just moved out of a role at Michigan State University where all 200 of my staff were located across the state of Michigan. 92% of the state of Michigan is rural. Very poor internet connections in those rural settings. And when internet is available, sometimes the bandwidth isn't there for individuals to be able to display screen. So I've heard, colleagues across the nation say, wow, it was so rude that person didn't have their screen on, or that person wasn't paying attention because their audio was off. Sometimes the capacity isn't there just from the standpoint of internet connectivity issues or bandwidth issues. Not everybody has a private space. So we're assuming, right, people have a comfortable environment or a private environment, they're able to take calls. We've heard of many colleagues, for example, having to be in a closet or in the garage to kind of escape, having to navigate children at the home during this physical distancing environment. So just different equity issues to keep in mind. Next slide, please.
This is an article written by Shonda Buchanan, who's a journal blogger, I guess, if you will. Shonda is both Black and she's also Indigenous, and she actually is talking here a little bit to sort of what Dr. Bonomi is just described, sort of this idea of like how we've been sort of thrust into this immediate Zoom environment. We've lost all these sort of ability to kind of taste, smell, right? And now I'm in this kind of artificial space. So Shonda pits this idea of an experience of being in a physical room presenting versus being in a physical space. So she talks about how she used to live in the university brick and mortar space, and she had this sort of uniform, her hair was pulled back, she felt very polished, she kind of knew where to go, how to act, like how to engage with people, always prepared. And then COVID comes in, this international pandemic, and it upends all of that, and she's not prepared for the newness of this virtual world. So she talks about being confronted with people's private homes for the first time, these virtual environments, colleagues wearing baseball caps, as Dr. Bonomi mentioned, cats, dogs, kids, backgrounds. She talks about how her braids feel actually in one really poignant example, and how she actually has to turn her Zoom camera off because she feels totally uncomfortable in this cultural fuss-free state, and she's got to move her braids back. So she finds herself really, and the article talks about her finding herself trying to constantly fit in, to create a new sense of belonging in what is now an artificial work world. You know, again, she's turning her camera off because she feels completely uncomfortable. She's not comfortable with colleagues seeing her in this fuss-free cultural state, and she wonders about other women of color in this sort of fuss-free state and how they're sort of faring, right? So if you think back to the sort of professor tweets, right, and this idea of like how unconscious bias is playing out, she's finding herself constantly trying to code switch, and it's just something we're seeing actually more and more in this space, is this idea of like, this is who I am in the virtual environment, this is who I am in the physical environment, and here's how I'm going to navigate that space. I think this is yours, Dr. Bonomi. You're on mute.
Hi, Brent. So before we go into the slides where we talk more specifically about what we were observing in virtual settings, we're wondering what you've noticed in Zoom or other virtual environments that you've been a part of. What have you noticed in terms of language? Who's talking? Who's not talking? If there's initial dialogue or icebreakers that are included in the conversation, what have you kind of noticed about where those dialogues tend to go? In terms of symbolism visual, what are you noticing about backgrounds? Are people using virtual backgrounds? Are they showing their natural backgrounds? What have you noticed about place, people, children, animals in the background, clothing, hair, differences in that regard? And then any actions, who tends to be included and who isn't, whose cameras tends to be off? And we don't want specific names or calling anyone out, but just sort of what are you noticing in Zoom or these Microsoft Teams or WebEx environments? Anything surprising, anything comforting, anything uncomfortable? The dialogue does not flow, lots of interrupting each other due to delay in sound, absolutely. How about others? What have you noticed in terms of language, symbolism, visual, people, places? Used to be very uncomfortable when people's environment wasn't professional, but now I crave seeing their dogs and kids. Absolutely, a source of comfort at this time. Absolutely. Teaching versus Zoom is challenging. Absolutely. More casual environment, easier to disengage. One or two people do most talking. That's true. We certainly see that based on power differential. We've heard other people when we've done this presentation say the leaders tend to be the ones who are sharing during the calls. People tend to turn their video cameras off because of vanity, and they admit it. Yep, not everybody can get used to the virtual background. People more likely to multitask. I missed a couple comments up here. Virtual backgrounds can be distracting due to the artifact created by movement. Yep, can shut off comments, a voice not heard, can choose to who speaks. More casual environment, easier to disengage. I think I had that one. Absolutely, so lots of differences, sort of what we're seeing in terms of the visual, in terms of language, in terms of multitasking, et cetera. Often too many comments are made too quickly to follow in the chat. Absolutely, sometimes you've got really personal stuff going on in the chat. They can be distracting, for example, to the presenters at hand or the dialogue that's happening. So thank you for engaging us in that. Next slide, please, Dr. Viveros. So as Dr. Eccles mentioned, we published a piece in MSU Today where we were talking specifically about some of the bias and things that we were seeing early on following the outbreak of COVID. So this has been in the March-April period in terms of these virtual settings, Zoom settings. So I'll talk about conversations, visual and symbols, and then actions, and we'll go into specifically some micro intervention strategies for when unconscious bias and microaggressions occur. What we were noticing in terms of conversation is they tend to be foregrounded by fun that we're having with our families while sheltering in place. And again, we're talking in the maybe month to 6 weeks following the COVID outbreak. So everyone was still, I think, in a state of shock, trying to figure out how to cope in this new environment. So naturally, some of the conversation was, hey, what are some of the fun things you did over the weekend with your family? Was an example of a facilitator question that went to a panel that we were participating in. What we were noticing also, though, is when these conversations were foregrounded by fun or concentration on family or fun activities that you're doing with a family over the weekend, is it tended to ignore the realities of how COVID was impacting persons of color, people living alone, people suffering from mental health issues, et cetera. And I'll give a specific example. So we were on a call where the facilitator said, we were wondering if everyone could throw in the chat, what fun thing did you do with your family over the weekend? There was a lot of great dialogue. People talked about dance parties. They talked about making s'mores with their families over the weekend. We had a staff member following that call write and say, you know what, that was nice to hear, but this is not how I'm experiencing COVID. I am married. At the same time, I've lost 5 family members over the last 6 weeks due to COVID. This person was identified as Black, located in the inner city Detroit, which, as you know, was impacted most pronounced by COVID in the early period, has since tapered off. So we just want to be conscious of those things. In terms of visual and symbols, what we were noticing is that tend to be normative environments. What do we mean by normative? So pretty acceptable to have pictures of beach vacations or some of the virtual environments of beach photos, et cetera, naturally wanting to transport us into a happier, maybe a lighter perception of where we actually are. We also noticed in one setting the use of wedding photos, not simply on a shelf behind us, but a picture actually facing the audience. And what we talked about in our piece here in MSU Today, that it tended to privilege heteronormativity. And we'll talk about some of the reaction. So by posting the wedding photo was basically privileging heteronormativity. And finally, action. Some attendees turned their cameras off. Was that always due to visual concerns, as we saw in the chat that you just entered? Not always. Sometimes there are other things happening in the environment that the individual does not want others to be privy to, may not have the bandwidth, et cetera. Next slide, please.
So we took the feedback we received on that article that showed up in MSU Today, and actually we actually hit most of the conservative front pages of some newspapers and some journals for a little bit. There's a lot going on. We created this thematic word cloud when we looked at the comments that are represented here. We were called mostly idiots, homosexuals, snowflakes, creators of a higher education holocaust, insane transsexuals, commies, indoctrinators. We know this is blowback received by many women. We looked at other similar articles at the time. In fact, right about the time we were writing this, we looked at an article that involved Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Dana Nessel, the Attorney General, and the buckets were the same, right? They tended to sort of rely on this kind of misogynistic, ideological, threatening, a lot of animal imagery, sort of themes, if you will. The comments here obviously have very little to do with the issue at hand and much more to do with social and personal identities, right? Some of the bias playing out, some of it conscious, some of it not so conscious, actually. Our goals today in this work, right? We talk a lot about this, and we always include this slide no matter who we're presenting to, is not to prohibit speech, but it really is to raise awareness and to push you a little bit to your learning edge. Unconscious bias sometimes is hard to talk about because of the issues that flow from it, as we mentioned earlier, right? Sexism, racism, it suggests we're complicit in them, and that is bad. It's bad and a moral issue, right? And none of us want to acknowledge we're bad. However, psychology research shows a lot of discrimination is happening below our level of awareness unconsciously. So while people might like to believe that we're not susceptible to these biases and stereotypes, the reality is that we all engage in them, all of us, right? whether we like it or not. And that reality also doesn't mean we're necessarily prejudiced or inclined to discriminate against other people. It simply means that our brain is working in a way that makes associations and generalizations, right? We all have this sort of lizard brain, as you know, the psychology and sort of neurodiversity research teaches us, and it classifies these things based on how we're taught, right? What we do next with that information is key in this space. So the idea of sort of coming to terms with our unconscious bias requires this sort of a certain level of humility, right? To understand that we're seeing the world the way we are, not necessarily the way it is. The best way to harness the differences, right, in this world is to make people aware of these distinctions, which is why you're getting this training today, which is why we're here delivering it. Giving you info is not the only answer, right? The first body of work is training, which is happening today. Once we have that done and get to that aha moment, it's like, oh, right, this is operating sort of, we're thinking under the influence, right? We can then sort of begin to move on to the next level. We need to reduce the level of shame in this work too. Too often DEI sort of operates from this level. And I did mention this earlier as kind of like, you know, bad, bad, bad you. And that's exactly what we don't want to be doing in this work. So we want to unpack this as sort of under this lens of socialization. We want doctors to spend more time with patients because we know that when that happens, they have better faring patients. In medicine, we're taught to operate faster, right? And that's often how you're measured. So here's the issue though, bias increases dramatically with shorter periods of time. So the longer time you get to know the patient, a number of good things happen. Trust, knowledge, safety, comfortableness, that all increases. So the value proposition of the work you do, right, is not just a cost proposition. There's these other sort of intangibles. So what to do? Strategies we're getting towards the end of the presentation, strategies to mitigate the impact of unconscious bias. I talked a little bit about this, mindfulness, right? Starting with this awareness, we know about the power of normal, and we talked about that, the power of sort of how we're all taught this. Again, it's a template we're all taught. And this is the starting point, knowing and being aware that we're thinking under the influence, right? Going back to what Dr. Bonomi talked about with language symbols. And then there's strategies to mitigate the impacts of unconscious bias. So again, there's a humility with coming to this notion that we're all biased, right? And we're all taught these stereotypes. As the Vietnamese example showed us, for example, right? We're seeing the world as we are, not necessarily as it is. Again, we talked about this through the lens of socialization. The cultural competency piece is really important in this work. We know more about how the mind works, and it shows us that bias is as natural as breathing. Again, right? I want to keep coming back to this. We think this way because it allows us to navigate the world, but in a lot of these DEI trainings, what tends to happen is, again, bias is seen as bad and we need to kind of eradicate it. And while that's true to some extent, but if we don't, on one hand, see bias as innate as well and teach that, and yet we're saying to sort of get rid of it, what we're saying people is to kind of akin to sort of stop breathing. And obviously, right, we need to deal with what we're being taught in order to really start mitigating its impact. So we need to rethink, in essence, how we're teaching about this work. There's also the role of leadership in helping to mitigate and how this happens, right? Dr. Bonomi talked about the example of the person with the pictures of the binary weddings behind them. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing this, but context is all important. That person was a leader in the organization. So think about the symbolism of doing that, right? As a leader who's leading a group of 200, whatever it is, thousands of people, and what it means to put a picture up and how much more importance it takes, right? All of these things create meaning. The human mind is fundamentally about creating meaning, and leaders are sense makers, right? And we set the stage. So, and they're the ones who, so when your leader, when Dr. John Riley sends an email to people, right, in his messaging, right, people read it. They take note of it. They say, all right, this matters, right, to leadership. And by definition, it's going to matter to us, right, as a unit, as followers for that leadership. So another piece of this would be, beyond that, right, is devoting resources to this work, right? And that's the last bullet point on this slide. So we have all these strategies, right? Intellectual humility, leaders as sense makers, and how we can sort of set the stage, reducing the level of shame, but we also have to devote resources to this because this stuff is just as important to unpack as everything else. And we need to begin sort of, beyond setting the tone, is putting some resources behind this work. Other strategies that we often talk about this work is obviously being willing to do the work, however uncomfortable, kind of coming to terms with our own biases are. practice identifying your unconscious bias. So that's with your own, personal board of trustees, networks, friends, partners, reading a lot of work. One of the seminal books we talk about in this field, and there's a lot of seminal books, I shouldn't say one, but it's one of a number, is Ijom Olu's So You Want to Talk About Race. What Olu does is provide us with the framework about how to deal with, example, microaggressions. And she gives you this framework, like start with stating what happened and then go to clarifying questions. And after you get those clarifying questions, reinforce that good intentions are not the point. Like, you may not have intended to do this, but here's the impact of your comment and how it comes off on this social group. And then understanding that you have a right to bring this up, right? I can see this is making you uncomfortable. Let's talk through it so it can be addressed. There are other things in this area, taking the implicit association test by Harvard. One of the most common ones is the race implicit association. Identifying stereotypes, counter stereotypes in popular film and music. Look up what you're thinking in Google. It's usually a good example. It's a good litmus test for sort of how portrayals are biased or not. You saw the examples today of university presidents and disabled people, and adopting an approach-oriented mindset, which starts with training like this. So I congratulate you all. I know you've done more than this training and that you'll continue to do this work. I know your dean and I know your chancellor are very dedicated to this work. And I know you now have your own DEI unit, diversity, equity, inclusion, that's going to focus specifically on this work at the Anschutz Medical Campus. So these are all good indicators of what's to come. Now we've gotten to the end of the presentation. We invite you to reflect on our presentation and if you saw any bias in what we presented today.
Right, so I'm gonna grab a couple of comments that came in quickly, Dr. Bavero. So Glenn asked about, what do you think about the implicit association test from Harvard? We are fans of it. I posted the link here in the chat. If you have not taken the IAT or the implicit association test, it can be very informative, kind of helping to understand how we sort of see gender, race, ethnicity, age through the lens of our unconscious bias. And a comment here from Terry about age bias, what can be frequently happen in a university environment. And if you could pull off your presentation, I want to pull up a slide, Dr. Viveros, to the point about age. If I can share my screen here. Terry, I'm glad you asked that question. Hopefully you can see my screen. You see my screen? So this is the photo aisle that I had gone through here in the Denver area just last week. Every single photo here kind of representing, as I mentioned, sort of the 25 to 35-year-old age group, tended to be white, tended to be a nuclear family, tended to be heterosexual couples, et cetera. You see a couple of images of older adults and then the left-hand slide, but just to the point, right, that when we market, we think about marketing, for example, really marketing to these younger age groups. And Terry would be interested to hear from you what you're seeing in healthcare around that age bias. Would love to hear more. And any other comments that any of you have related to today's presentation? Questions?
Well, that was a great presentation. Yeah, Claudia, please go ahead.
I have a question. So in healthcare, we usually focus or hear more frequently about patients not getting fair treatment because of implicit bias. Can you comment on any strategies of how providers can handle or manage a situation when they are the ones receiving the microaggressions and they are expected to keep moving? In anesthesia, as you know, we don't have the luxury of time. We only encounter patients for a few minutes. We only are able to connect with them for a few minutes before we need to roll to the OR, before we need to get going with the day. So any strategies that we can use or that we can learn about how to handle the situation?
Yeah, thanks so much for your question, Claudia. So you're talking about when the microaggressions perpetrated toward the healthcare provider, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so we talk about a couple things, and I'll have Dr. Rivero's comment as well. So really important, this type of training and conversation, we like to say it's not a one-time shot. So it's great that your group is having us talk today, but the more that it become a regular part of your conversation so that you're talking with each other when these experiences occur, because often what we see when healthcare providers or professors are the target of microaggressions, right? They just kind of shut down. They don't talk to anybody about their experiences. And as we see from the literature, these tend to be then internalized and have negative impacts on emotional and physical health over the short and long term. So having conversations regularly with your healthcare team is important. Secondly, and related to that, is developing a network of others that you can have these conversations about with on a regular basis. So often be a very isolating experience when we are the target of microaggressions, but the more that we are opening up and developing these supportive networks around us can be quite helpful. Leadership will play a critical role. I think Dr. Barberos will have something to say about that, in the sense that leaders that are really, a grand sphere of influence and can influence the way healthcare teams support and mobilize to support each other. But I think being cognizant, the mindfulness and openness to check in on each other is key.
I think, Claudia, there's probably a little bit of personal strategies and institutional strategies that we need to look at in terms of how we break it up. I mean, institutional might be a little bit more training and sort of understanding that there are networks you can create. Like, you may not always be in a position in that time when you're in the OR to sort of deal with that patient right away, but it's certainly something you can download with. We used to have, I did a presentation once at the Anschutz Medical Campus, and one of the things we did was we had this strategy for women leaders, and we said, every time you hear a microaggression, put $1 in a jar. And then at the end of the year, we had all this money and we would donate it to sort of a local organization. It was just one way to kind of relieve ourselves. And that could be, and again, microaggressions are perpetrated everybody, men, women, right? Again, there's all these social identity points. But another personal strategy might be to sort of use some of Olu's framework. Like, if you're in the position of directing, if there's a particularly egregious comment and you feel comfortable doing so, you can say, help me understand why you think that. Like, what is it about this identity that makes you think that way? Let's unpack that. Again, I get that's really hard. You're in life and death situations, and it's often hard. And I'm not sure, without knowing exactly, it's hard to answer questions in the hypothetical. But I think that I go back to sort of all the work that we're seeing is that the longer you spend with people, and I don't know how you sort of come to terms with that in the healthcare space, because everything's about time and efficiency and but the longer you spend with people, the less this happens, right? And it's really, really stressful situations. And when you don't have much time, that's usually when we see bias really increase. I mean, the literature shows that time and time and time again. And until we get to a point in healthcare where you have the luxury of time, or we eradicate bias, I think probably time is going to be a more realistic thing on this one. We're going to have to deal with some of this and find strategies, like, again, networking, directing, delaying and talking about this afterwards in places like this.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. That's a hard question to answer, a very difficult one.
I was going to ask a quick question and just state that thank you for your talk, first of all, but I think one of the most common microaggressions that we see is when a female colleague, physician, goes to see a patient, and the patient assumes that the female colleague of mine is a nurse and describes them as nurse so-and-so. When I'm with them, or when one of our male colleagues is alongside one of our female physician colleagues, should we be expected, or should we step in and say something, and or does that perpetuate the potential white male savior complex that we may already have? Or should we allow our physician female colleague to address themselves as the physician and take advantage of that situation to correct themselves, or correct the patient, that is?
I would ask it's Dr. Simmons, right? I think it was who's asking.
Yes,
Dr.
yes.
I would argue that you ask your female colleague what your female colleague wants. I mean, particularly if that example happens and to just avoid, like, mirror, as kind of work we do, say mirror what they need. We teach about that. Ask them, would you feel comfortable if I did this? And if they did, next time it happens, you say, well, actually, this is Dr. So-and-so. Or if not, if that female colleague feels comfortable doing it themselves, then at least you've sort of, you can get away from this idea of, like, how do I interact in this space?
Another question came in from Dr. Gumidaya. Would these same strategies apply to minimize implicit bias in residency and faculty recruitment?
Yeah, a lot of them do, unfortunately. You know, we saw all of this stuff about gender. That doesn't change really when you're moving into the world of academic medicine, because at the end of the day, we're in an academic space, right? The idea of, I can't tell you how many promotion and tenure letters that I vetted that have this, the what if, I always say the what if example in DI, like, well, despite the fact that this person has children, they've made it, or despite the fact, we see that a lot. There's a reason that, you know, in the both, I have two children that are both musicians, and a lot of blind auditions, sort of, right? They don't even like look at your sex or gender anymore, and you're playing instruments behind the screen. There's a reason we're doing that, because we're seeing greater diversity in orchestras as a result. So there's a lot of that going on. I think that a lot of the strategies we talked about, right? Mirroring examples, having a personal board of trustees, networking, checking in with people, lots of reading. Another thing we teach a lot about in this work is to not put this work on the back of BIPOC, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color. Like, it's like, oh, you know, you're Spanish or you're Latinx. What's it like being like that in this space? Or you're Black, like microaggressions must be a really big deal. Like, that's exactly what we don't want you to do. So sort of as allies in this work, as upstanders or whatever you want to call white accomplices, there's a lot of stuff we can do to help mitigate the impact of this work, including just becoming knowledgeable about it ourselves. You know, I know you've had more than this training, and again, I applaud you for doing that stuff. I know that your work's incredibly difficult and stressful, and you're finding time to do this, which tells me how important it is, right, to this department, to this program.
I also have a question. I know we have all these institutional help, and you guys help people educate everybody. So what I was wondering, I was thinking about this last night, does any department have like a, bias in medicine task force or something where they, have a closer look what's going on in the department, who might need help, so you have more frequent discussions, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Dr. Eckel. We've been talking about it, particularly one that kind of looks at cultural competency too, right? This idea of like, how do we teach cultural competency? How do we look at bias? How do we look at it's bi-directional? I completely agree with you. Just as much as it could be us sort of not understanding cultures, it's also cultures that come, some of the bias that comes back at us as providers. So for sure. We were having talks with Dean Riley about that, and definitely with Regina Richards, who's now the new DEI for the Anschutz Medical Campus. So I think there's going to be something happening in that area very soon. I'll make sure I bring it. I poke Shanta Zimmer as well to see if we can get some work done in that area. So write that down. I think we're at time. I don't know if there's you were a pretty engaging group.
No, I think that was an excellent and outstanding presentation. Really have to thank you both also for taking your time and educating us. I really learned a lot. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.